Xiangqi, the Chinese term for fragrance. But that's not all. There's more than meets the nose. Hey everyone, I'm Sigi, and I welcome you back to the third installment of the Pu'er Tea Lexicon video series. Today, we are talking about a whole bunch of terms surrounding fragrance and things related to it. Xiangqi describes the aroma or fragrance of a tea. However, taste and smell are closely linked together. Xiang by itself is mainly used for smell, but can also be used to describe taste or even other sensations. The boundaries between wei from the last video and xiang this time are thus quite fluid. Similar to the English words taste and fragrance, xiang carries more positive connotations, where wei is more neutral, leaving more room for terminology that describes negative qualities of any given tea. Xiang being more than just smell becomes immediately apparent if we look at the various areas where it can be felt. There's the palate, or the roof of your mouth, on the tongue, sublingually, on the cheeks, and in your throat. In my recent video, where I tried the 2022 Zhang Sheng Pu'er, I described how the tea's fragrance fills my throat and my entire oral cavity. This sensation pertains to Xiang just as much as, if not even more than what we sense with our noses. Alright, first off, let's take a look at some odors that are commonly found in fresh pu'er tea. Qiaokeli, which is a grass-like odor that's produced when the tea leaves are fried very unripe, before they have finished withering, in other words. It's less common with contemporary pu'er processing techniques, except for very, very fresh tea, like just after the harvest, but it's more common in teas like Tieguanyin and Taiwanese oolongs nowadays. Next up, there is a term that you might already be familiar with if you've watched the previous video, which is qing xiang. And this is the fresh fragrance of sun-dried tea before it begins to ferment naturally. So here already we have one clear example of wei being used to denote a more negative word and xiang being used to denote a more positive word. Next up, we have floral fragrance, something that many of you, I'm sure, are also familiar with, called hua xiang in Chinese. Usually, this floral fragrance is produced if the leaves of the tea oxidize between 10 and 25%. Do note, however, that these oxidation numbers are specifically for pu'er tea. Floral fragrance can be expressed in other types of tea for very different reasons, such as, for example, a choice of cultivar. This floral fragrance has three different subtypes. The first one being Xian Shuang Xing Hua Xiang, which is a fresh floral fragrance similar to lily of the valley or Bai He, which is a type of lily that's common in China. Importantly, it is a purely olfactory sensation, unlike other types of fragrance that we are going to be talking about later in this video. So right now, we are actually strictly talking about things that you can pick up with your nose. The second flower fragrance we're talking about today is a sweet and mellow floral fragrance called Tianchun Xinghua Xiang, a floral fragrance that's comparable to jasmine or gardenia, and it's supposed to make people take deep breaths when they experience it. So already with this one, we're moving away from just smell and more into kind of how your body will react to it. When you smell this specific kind of floral fragrance, you will be made to take like deeper breaths, calm sort of down a bit. And yeah, there's something going on there besides just smell. The third in the category is a soft floral fragrance, which is Rou He Xing Hua Xiang. And that is a floral aroma that is comparable to roses and exhibited by teas that have been stored for a few years. Orchid fragrance, called Lan Xiang, such as from Milanxiang in Dansong, also belongs to this category, but is an even softer and even more gentle aroma than roses. While the other two floral aromas we've talked about, the sweet and mellow fragrance and the fresh floral fragrance, are more sort of arousing in a way, this one, the soft floral fragrance, is more calming. Okay, after this category, if we go up a bit further in oxidation level, there is fruity fragrance called Guo Xiang. It's usually produced between about 25 and 40% oxidation. Of course, the same caveat as with the floral fragrance also applies here. This is specific to Pu'er, and there are many different reasons why a tea would have a sort of fruit aroma. This really is just specifically Pu'er and why it might occur there. For this one, we also have 3 different subtypes. First off, there is an apple fragrance called Ping Guo Xiang, and that one is very common in like really fresh tea. The same kind of tea where we'd expect these sort of green grassy-like flavors. It's basically like if you drink a tea right after harvest and processing, then it's somewhat likely to have apple fragrance. The second fragrance in this category is watermelon aroma, or Xi Gua Xiang in Chinese. This one can be present in tea that has been stored for a slightly longer time. So maybe tea that hasn't like completely begun transforming yet, tea that's still fairly young and has these kind of high aromatic notes, but that has already lost a bit of its sort of initial bite that you'd get if a tea presents apple fragrance instead. All right, and the third fruity fragrance, and at least in my experience the most common one in Pu'er tea, is plum fragrance, or Meizi Xiang, which is one of the absolute classic Pu'er tea fragrances. It's cool and slightly sour, kind of comparable to biting into a fresh plum. I think if you see someone in an English language tea blog describing a sort of stone fruit note in their Pu'er tea, then this is probably the closest equivalent in the Chinese tea terminology. Okay, we've discussed a number of fragrances that can be found in fresh Pu'er tea. Let's now take a look at some odors that are present in more mature tea. First off, we have honey aroma, called Mi Shang in Chinese. This is a sweet fragrance that emerges in Pu'er tea after a certain degree of natural post-fermentation, usually along the line of 5 to 10 years after production. Mi Xiang is often a lingering taste and can be seen as a sign of good quality. If you have a properly stored pu'er tea, it will develop honey fragrance after a few years. Now, I found a few articles and discussions surrounding this on the Chinese internet. There are a few differing perspectives, some a bit more radical, some less. I might end up making an additional video just specifically talking about this whole like Mi Xiang and 5 to 10 years thing, but that will come after this Lexicon series is concluded. Alright, next up we have Mu Xiang, which is woody aroma, also known as old wood fragrance, which is Lao Mu Xiang, or resin fragrance, which is Mu Zi Xiang, or even pine resin fragrance, which is Song Zi Xiang. Think of this particular fragrance as resinous rather than just woody. It's produced by the large amount of wood resin that's contained within a tea that's made from ancient tea trees in a good ecological environment. So if your tea isn't just woody, but actually resinous, it's a very good sign that you might be dealing with some higher quality base material. Next up, we have Yao Shang, which is a medicinal fragrance that's reminiscent of traditional Chinese medicine. Usually, it's related to the previously mentioned Mu Xiang to some extent, but it is a little different. And if you've ever been to a TCM store, then you will probably be familiar with this smell. As the last word in this category, we have Chen Xiang. Chen Xiang, sorry, wrong tone there, which is aged aroma, or chen wei, aged flavor. And this is honestly one of the most complex terms in this whole endeavor, and one of the kind of terms that everything else sort of feeds into. Aged aroma is not a single specific aroma in most cases, but more of an overall impression about a tea's maturity and the presence of a variety of fragrances that indicate said maturity. This is just a brief summary and only barely scratches the surface of what Chen Xiang really is. But because it's so long, I'm going to produce a shorter video after this one that only specifically explains some things and concepts related to aged aroma and what it really could be, what kind of pertains to it, how it works, all of those kind of things. If I did that in here, it would unfortunately take way too long. So instead, let's leave it at that for now. There is this kind of aroma-related term that's used to judge a tea's level of maturity, and that is Chen Xiang. But let's move on to some more unusual odors in tea. First off, there is dried fungus aroma, or ganjun xiang, which is produced by the presence of yeasts. For those of you that have watched my now fairly old live stream on pu'er storage, there is a section where I talk about the kinds of things that develop in pu'er tea at varying levels of humidity. And one of the things I talked about are yeasts. So if your tea is stored at that level of humidity and under the right general conditions, then this dried fungus aroma might emerge. It's also important to note that unusual in this context doesn't mean bad. Quite the opposite, actually. These are by no means considered negative qualities of a tea, especially the one we're going to talk about now, which is Pectin aroma, or guo jiao xiang. And Pectin aroma is a kind of slightly sweet aroma that's comparable to boiled young corn. It's produced when the pectins in the tea leaves dissolve at high temperatures, usually 95 degrees Celsius and above. This pectin aroma tends to be a sign of high-quality ancient tree tea. It also affects the texture of your tea. If there is pectin present in your tea soup, it's going to look thick and shiny, or hou fa liang in Chinese. Next up, we have some other sort of more uncategorized odors in tea to talk about. First up, there is hair fragrance, or hao xiangwei. Hair fragrance is associated with trichomes, or trichomes. I'm not sure how it's pronounced exactly, sorry. The small white hairs that are present on fresh and tender tea buds. This fragrance is considered sort of fine, as opposed to the more coarse fragrance of larger and more mature leaves, and is usually associated with teas that are really gentle and subtle. Next up, we have sugar fragrance, called tang xiang in Chinese. This one is quite common in pu'er, is usually accompanied with a cooling sensation in the throat. It's seen as a characteristic of an excellent tea. The source of this sugar fragrance is the fairly high amount of soluble sugars in pu'er tea that, kind of surprisingly for me at least, make up about 4 to 7% of the dry leaf mass of the tea. It's honestly much more than I would have expected. Related to this sugar fragrance, there also is caramel fragrance, or jiao tang xiang, which comes from the sugars in the tea being caramelized due to being baked or having xiaqing done at too high of a temperature. This fragrance is comparable to the smell of sweet baked goods, such as cookies, and can be seen as an indicator that a tea is not going to age particularly well, because a high temp xiaqing would, of course, also mean that many of the enzymes in the tea that are responsible for its maturing get deactivated. Chocolate fragrance, Qiaokeli Xiang, falls into the same category as caramel fragrance. So both of these, while they might taste quite nice, are fairly undesirable when it comes to a tea's aging potential. So if you spot those in a younger tea, don't buy it with intentions of keeping it for long. Okay. Now, after some of these things, let's go back to unpleasant odors in tea. First off, we can repeat two odors from the first video on wei, and those are a smoky flavor, which is xiangwei, or a scorched flavor, which is jiao. If you don't remember those two, I recommend going back to the video on ziwei and watching to find out what these two words really encompass. Next up in this category, there is a frying green smell, or qiaokeli, which is comparable to green beans or roasted chestnuts. And this happens when the shaching is done before the leaves were sun-dried properly. Also, something very similar to this fried green smell is a baked green smell called xiangwei. This one is comparable to just roasted chestnuts and happens when the leaves were not sun-dried but instead baked to dry instead, and with the shaching being done immediately afterwards with no sort of period of rest in between. Okay. Finally, we've talked about some rather specific aspects of different teas, but one kind of thing I keep repeating both within this series and with other videos I produce is that we also need to take a more holistic view at tea, and we need to sort of describe our overall experience with it rather than just individual aspects. And there are a few words that relate also to a tea's fragrance that I would like to mention here that do exactly that. So here are some general words to describe the quality of a tea's aroma. First up, there is high aroma, called gao yang in Chinese. This is an intense and lasting aroma. An aroma that kind of really hits you, is there, is present, and just stays and won't leave. It's like very strong, and a tea can be good in that way. Almost the opposite of this one is a subdued aroma called chen, which is a lot more subtle. Teas with still like an interesting, complex and engaging aroma, but one that's much less present, one where you kind of actively have to seek for it and be like patient and wait. And finally, there's a third category, which is a reserved aroma called nei lian. And this name is specifically meant in the sense of that particular artistic style. For those of you that are more into Chinese art and might have heard of it there. A reserved tea that is rich, harmonious, and lasting, but not ostentatious in the same way as a tea with high aroma would be. It's a tea that still scores strongly in all of these various aspects, including fragrance, but it's not a tea that's gonna kind of hit you over the head with it. That's what a tea with high fragrance would do. A reserved tea shows excellent qualities, but sort of, I don't want to say only to those who can see them. It's more like if you're a bit patient with the tea and you like brew it in the right manner and all of that, then a reserved tea will reward you with a very unique experience. It's not a tea that like you put into your mouth and then it's immediately there. That's not what a reserved tea does. But as you kind of continue the session, more and more things, more and more layers start to emerge, and that's where you kind of end up on. Okay, with that out of the way, the final thing I'm going to do today is leave you with a list of other fragrances that might be found in pu'er tea. The first one is Hei Cha, which is lotus fragrance, and is usually divided into two kinds. There's lotus flower fragrance, which is Hei Hua Xiang, and lotus leaf fragrance, Hei Ye Xiang. The latter emerges after fermenting delicate buds and leaves into Shu Pu'er and storing it in dry conditions for about 5 years or more. The prime example of this is the Da Yi Golden Needle White Lotus Shu Pu'er tea, which is one of their flagship Shu Pu'er products. People who mention He Xiang usually refer to lotus leaf fragrance and are talking about Shu Pu'er most of the time. Next up, there is dried fruit fragrance, or Gan Guo Xiang. This one is usually associated with very old tea, and rarely, very rarely, also found in Shu Pu'er. It's comparable, surprisingly enough, like you wouldn't expect this from its name, to bitter almond, or what was the other type of nut? Or pine nuts. Yeah, bitter almond or pine nuts. So if somebody talks about a dried fruit fragrance in Chinese, then they might not be talking about things like dried peaches, for example, or dried dates or something like that we would commonly eat as dried fruit here. Speaking of dates, though, that brings us to the next aroma we're going to talk about, which is date aroma, or zhao xiang. And this one is a characteristic of mature tea. It smells like dried dates, which is a kind of sugary sweetness with a woody finish. So in this impression of date aroma, we already find two of the other fragrances we talked about in this video again. So I guess this is a great example to showcase how all of these things are kind of linked together and they don't stand alone on their own. There's also a fragrance that's very similar to date aroma, and that is Longan fragrance, or Gui Yuan Xiang in Chinese. This one can usually be found in high-grade Shu Pu'er though, whereas date aroma is also decently common in Sheng Pu'er. Longan fragrance usually comes with heavier fermentation and a higher temperature qing. It's comparable to date aroma, but less mellow overall. Next up, there is Camphor aroma, or zhang xiang, which is an aroma that emerges in tea that's been stored for a long time. And it's kind of similar to camphor wood, if you've ever smelled that. This aroma is also associated with a smooth texture and a comfortable sensation in the mouth. So yeah, a tea that has already undergone a lot of transformation will exhibit this particular aroma. Okay, we've arrived at the last term for today. This one also relates to mature tea, and it is Ginseng aroma, or zhan xiang in Chinese. It's kind of a vaguely woody and earthy aroma that's similar to ginseng root. And it is usually, as I said, present in mature tea. As opposed to something like camphor aroma, ginseng fragrance is commonly associated with a feeling of calmness. So once again, an example of a place where the presence of the word xiang transcends just what we perceive with our noses. Alright, however, that is all for today. I hope I was able to introduce to you a variety of terms that relate to the fragrance of pu'er tea in one way or another. Many that are also just not specifically fragrance, and hopefully some that will be able to expand not just your tea vocabulary, but maybe the way in which you think about and approach pu'er tea in some sense. This is all from me. I hope you enjoyed or got something out of this video, and I'll be back next month with a new installment of the Pu'er Tea Lexicon. Goodbye.